Howdy folks, how are we all doing? It is Saturday, August 7th, 2021, and I'm over at the Blinds Pass Beach, which is also near Inglewood, Florida. So I'm just enjoying my time being by the water. But aside from just observing the water, there's a couple of other plants that I wanted to point out while I was on my little stroll out here. So without further ado, let's get into it, shall we? Okay, right in front of me is a well-known pine found in Florida called the sand pine. Now, some of you may have heard of it, you know, the term conifer, but conifer actually refers to a broad group of plants that bear cones. And pines are one of the many subgroups that falls under conifer. So pines are one group, firs are another, F-I-R, and another group are spruces, and then Jupiters. So those are some of the four main groups, from what I've learned, that falls under conifer. The reason that we know that this is a pine is the fact that in the scientific name it has the genus of Pinus, and that is how we know that it is a pine indeed. So the sand pine, it's in the name. It typically tends to thrive in sand and coastal environments with a USDA zone of 10. So, even though this may seem rather a little tall, it's actually reaching towards the end of its life. These can only live for maybe a couple of decades long, just because of the types of conditions that it has to go through. And it's actually a distant cousin of the slash pine, which is one of the most prevalent pines also found in Florida. If we go up just a little bit, you can see the needles up here are a little shorter. I would say on average they're probably about 5 to 6 inches long. And then like the pine cones themselves, they're probably, you know, as a comparison, they're probably about the size of, you know, like those candies, you know, like those Whopper candies, those chocolates. Probably about the size of those as like a comparison. But that is some insight of the sand pine. But then moving on, we've actually got ourselves up here the beach Naupaka. And some of you may have seen this. However, though, the beach Naupaka is actually an invasive plant in Florida. This plant is actually native to regions of Southeast Asia, and even parts of Hawaii as well, but mostly in Southeast Asia. That's like the prevalent area. As you can see, the leaves are kind of like a shape of a pear, you know, like the fruit, and mostly it only has like a slight little indent at the tip of the plant. And it is, you know, the texture, it is somewhat succulent. And then they've got something called the half flower, which is completely white in appearance. And it has usually up to 5 individual petals. Legend has it, I believe it was Hawaiian legend, be sure to clarify, but the legend was there was a woman who had a lover, and the story goes that they really enjoyed eating these, because these actually are indeed edible. You can eat them. So the woman, she had it at her home as like a symbolism of her relationship with her lover. But then as her lover went out to sea on a particular journey, he never came back. And so she was in mourning, and unfortunately she committed suicide. And so the story goes, the half flower shows that the other half of her, which was her lover and partner, never made it back. But then here is the actual berry itself. They are known to have somewhat of a sweet flavor. A little bit. Kinda, sorta. Not really. This is from what I've learned about it anyways. But they were mostly introduced as sort of like a ornamental purpose. And it was also provided in nurseries as well. So yeah. And this is commonly confused with the native inkberry. But the difference with inkberry, as I've pointed out, is the leaves have a bit more indentation, and the berries that they produce, you know, like these guys, they're completely black, like olives. So that, and the inkberry is actually endangered because of these plants. And they pose a problem for any of the native sea turtles in this region, especially for nesting habitat, as they tend to act like a blanket. Okay, so moving on, we've got the cook pine, which is right above me. So this is practically found in several different parts of the world, especially in Hawaii and even parts of Australia. And the reason that they call it cook pine is it's actually named after a famous British explorer and captain named James Cook. Some of you may have heard of him. He was one of those captains who was really responsible for allowing the colonization of Australia. So, essentially, he found a bunch of these during his journeys. The fascinating thing about cook pine is if you look, the needles, they're a bit more tubular shaped as opposed to very thin. And the branches are oftentimes a lot shorter too. And they can grow very quickly and tall as well. Like this one, just from initial glance, it's probably about 50 or so feet high. And here's another fascinating thing about the cook pine, is since they're a very equatorial pine, and they also grow around, you know, coastal environments and even coral reefs, it's also known as the coral reef pine, it always tilts. You can kind of see, like, it has a slight tilt. Well, there was a study, you know, that took place that was assessing as to why the cook pines have that tilt, no matter how far it is in its growth. Well, it always tilts towards the equator, depending on how far away it is. Usually, most times, on average, it has about an 8-degree tilt in its growth. But, you know, like if you're navigating, that's a good way to indicate, you know, which direction is what. So with it tilting towards the equator, it's reasonable to say that, you know, if we're ever navigating, we know that to my right, we're facing towards the south. Okay, so moving on to the last plant, which I'm going to cover a bit more brief on, is the mother-in-law's tongue. Now, in terms of why they really call it that, I'm not really entirely sure. But mother-in-law's tongue is an invasive plant as well. As you can see, it grows quite rapidly. And it's somewhat characteristic of a succulent. And it's native to parts of Southeast Asia, too, I believe, as I can recall. So, that is the mother-in-law's tongue. I know, it's a bit of a funny name, right? But hey, you know what? I don't make the names. So, yeah, I mean, those are just some native flora and trees that I have been able to find while I was out strolling. So, I hope you guys learned something of value from this video and got something out of it, you know, for any of you who will see them in the near future. And I want to thank you all for taking the time to watch this. I know that this video is slightly longer, but you know, as always, there's information to interpret and share among all of you. So alrighty, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and once again, Journey on a Journey is outwards. Take care, folks.